Then she tied him to a tree so the dragon couldn't fly. She told him he was mean and it made the dragon cry. When he finally apologized, she offered him some tea. He accepted it graciously. Now he visits every weekend with the princess who saved herself.
Dealing with Dragons by Patricia C. Reedy is a 1990 young adult fantasy novel following the rebellious Princess Cimmerine, who runs away from a stifling arranged marriage to become the servant of a dragon named Kazul. This was a favorite of mine as a kid. I got it from the library many times, and I even borrowed the audiobook when that was available, and then I finally got my parents to buy me a copy of the book, and I loved the heck out of that one, and moved on to appreciate the rest of the series. It is the first book in the Enchanted Forest Chronicles, which is made up of dealing with dragons, searching for dragons, calling on dragons, talking to dragons, and the anthology Book of Enchantments. That is not, however, the order of publication. Reedy started the series with a standalone Talking to Dragons in 1985, and then she wrote a short story prequel to Talking with Dragons called The Improper Princess, which was published in the anthology Spaceships and Spells in 1987. And then she adapted that into the full novel Dealing with Dragons in 1990. I didn't know any of that until I did research for this review, which explains the radical tone shift of Talking to Dragons, given that it was intended as a standalone novel, written from the perspective of a character ignorant to nearly all of the characters and world building done in the other books. Dealing with Dragons, Searching for Dragons, and Calling on Dragons were intended to be read as a prequel series, with the short stories in the Book of Enchantments as sequels. But I didn't know that when I read them as a kid. Maybe if the publisher had the cover of Dealing with Dragons say, the prequel to Talking to Dragons, instead of Book 1 of the Enchanted Forest Chronicles, I would have read Talking to Dragons first, and appreciated the series as the author intended. But the way the publisher marketed the book was as the first book in a series, and that's how I and a whole lot of other kids read it. For the purposes of this review, I will present it as I read it, and employ death of the author analysis. For all I loved the book as a kid, my appreciation of it was spoiled for several years by radical feminists. They really don't like the whole thing about Cimmerine working for a dragon and equate it with slavery. And I bought it. I thought they were right. The author clearly had some issues, and Cimmerine's empowerment arc is subverted by the fact that she essentially enslaves herself in the process. Right? Right? Wrong. I actually went into this review thinking that I was going to be talking about how messed up this book was, how messed up the author was, but I read carefully and discovered that this negative take on the book is completely wrong. There is nothing to indicate that Cimmerine's decision to become a dragon's princess is anything but consensual. Cimmerine herself is even the one who suggests it. The only reason radical feminists even thought otherwise is the same oversensitive dislike of hierarchies that it leads them to demonize things like consensual BDSM, exacerbated by not reading the book carefully. It's the same hair-trigger overreaction I constantly criticize in my reviews of the works of Joss Whedon. And I let those women ruin my appreciation of a childhood favorite? Ugh. For this review, I'm going to take the opposite stance as I did with Fledgling. In the case of Fledgling, I was calling the book that a lot of feminists say is a great feminist work actually an unrecognized slavery fantasy. For Dealing with Dragons, I'm going to say that the book that a lot of feminists say is an unrecognized slavery fantasy is in fact the great feminist work it appears to be. It has its problems, as all stories do, but its bad reputation is entirely undeserved. The story begins in the kingdom of Linderwall, a very proper kingdom that thoroughly obeys all the traditions one would expect of a traditional fantasy kingdom. The king and queen have 7 daughters. The first 6 are very proper princesses, who follow all of the annoying stereotypes. But the 7th, Princess Cimmerine, is a rebellious tomboy with an improper appearance to match. All her sisters are stereotypically short and blonde. She is tall and dark-haired. This makes her an interesting contrast to Rapunzel from Tangled, where they make Rapunzel short and blonde like the stereotype, but they make her personality differ, and by the end make her a brunette. Of course, a comparison to Tangled can't go without mention of the gag in which a frying pan is found to be an absurdly powerful weapon, as is likewise poked fun at in the Book of Enchantments short story Utensile Strength, with the magical artifact the Frying Pan of Doom. Cimmerine hates her proper princess lessons, and she sneaks around court to badger castle servants to teach her more interesting things, like sword fighting, cooking, magic, the Latin language, and horse riding. but her parents invariably find out and end the lessons, giving her a hodgepodge of somewhat useful skills. While it makes sense for there to be a negative portrayal of her parents keeping her from doing the things that interest her, I don't like the general implication that her proper sisters and the other proper princesses who show up later are lesser people for embracing the traditionally feminine propriety that is put upon them. I think George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire has a more balanced take on the issue, where the narrative equally respects Arya Stark's tomboy rebelliousness and her sister Sansa's embrace of traditionally feminine propriety. When Cymrine finds out that her parents have arranged for her to marry the obnoxious Prince Thranduil, she tries various things to get out of the wedding that fail, and then she says aloud that she would rather be eaten by a dragon. A nearby talking frog overhears her, and questions why she would. He hears her story and then suggests some people he knows who could help her, giving her some traditional fairy tale directions to a location where she could meet these people and ask for their help.
Danger, Will Robinson! Danger! No, Will Robinson! Danger!
She really should have clarified what the frog meant here. She runs away and follows the frog's directions to a house that is actually a portal to a cave system in the Mountains of Mourning, presumably several miles away. She finds herself enclosed in a cave with multiple dragons. Uh-oh, that frog took her literally. And that's why you need to be very careful about your wording when dealing with these kinds of characters. The dragons do not know why they're there. The frog contacted them about making a deal with a princess, but the idea that they're supposed to eat her is not understood. A particularly mean dragon named Morons, no really, wants to eat her anyway, but the other dragons want to hear her out before they act. Morons is a selfish creep, but the other dragons will better themselves only to the degree that they think is fair, according to tradition. Of course, a dragon's sense of morality is different from a human's. They don't have anything against killing and eating another thinking being, but they will only do it when it is prudent to do so, largely based on tradition. They're also fine with abducting princesses for a while, as long as it is done properly, according to their traditions. The tradition is that a monster, not exclusively a dragon, will kidnap a princess, keep them for a while, and then later a knight or prince will fight off the monster and rescue the princess. And the princess's father will grant this hero his daughter's hand in marriage, as a reward. Apparently this is the only way that princesses are properly married off. One of the stall tactics that Cymrine employs to keep from marrying Thranduil is to ask her father to arrange her to be kidnapped by an ogre, so that Thranduil will have to rescue her. And the king halfway agrees before the queen talks him out of it because of the scheduling difficulties that this would present. It's not stated whether the king plans on sending a messenger to correspond with an ogre to arrange an abduction, or if he intends to simply send her into ogre territory while loudly saying, "I hope no one abducts me, a poor defenseless princess, especially not any ogres." With extreme Terry Pratchett snark, Reedy presents a fantasy world where all of the fairy tale tropes are traditions that all of the characters are compelled to adhere to through peer policing. No one wants to be thought of as improper, so they force these fantasy tropes to happen as a matter of tradition. Even if the stakes are life or death, the characters will play out the tradition because that's their way of life. It takes a rebellious character like Cymrine to even think of doing something new. So, faced with a bunch of dragons, one of whom is ready to eat her, and the others willing to hear her out, having embarked on this journey in search of people willing to help her out of her arranged marriage to Thranduil, she decides to see if they could genuinely help her. She tells her story, and the dragons aren't particularly sympathetic, as they're also creatures mired in tradition. But one of them, Kazul, is intrigued, and questions what Cymrine wants them to do. Cymrine draws on her knowledge of dragons, confirms with Kazul that dragons are very fond of princesses, and she makes them an offer. She knows that dragons like abducting princesses to serve them, and she volunteers to be one of their servants. That does not go over well with most of the dragons. That's so improper! It goes against all tradition! Who would want an improper princess? It's a parody of the way her human court reacts to her by having even these selfish monsters helplessly mired in tradition and offended by her impropriety. They will actually reject her as a servant because her volunteering to be a servant goes against tradition. It's not because they're evil and just want to hurt her, it's because it's just not done! Kazul, however, accepts Cymrine as her servant. She is a much more progressive dragon, willing to go against tradition, and she decides to make this improper arrangement. Her motives for doing so are unclear. She says it's because she likes Cherry's Jubilee, which is one of the only recipes that Cymrine knows how to make. But I think she's intrigued by Cymrine and wants to help her out in a way mutually beneficial. Technically, her being in it purely for Cherry's jubilee would be okay, as their mutual need leads them to a fair trade of room and board in exchange for housekeeping, cooking, and cleaning Kazul's scales. However, it is notable that Kazul seems to genuinely want to help her out, as it emphasizes her nonconformist attitude. She and Simrine are effectively counterparts in defying the traditions of their respective societies. This is not slavery. This is a genuine, fair exchange within the parameters of this world. It is only the radical socialist underpinnings of radical feminism, leading radical feminists to be suspicious of all forms of hierarchy and trade, that leads them to think that this is slavery. While the dragons are dangerous, Simrine does not become Kazul's princess under threat to her life. She makes the offer herself to escape from a world where she would have no choice. And her and Kazul forming the arrangement in defiance of human and dragon tradition allows her to achieve freedom.
Gotta find the freedom that's promised me.